Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to see you all here. We're honored to have you at AEI. I'm Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event in partnership with the YG Network and National Affairs. We want to talk to you today about policy solutions to bringing back the middle class and solving problems of poverty, persistent problems of poverty that we've seen now for 50 years. Today is, as you know, the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society speech. That was the big beginning of an experiment that basically remade the way our government interacts with its citizens, particularly its citizens who are especially economically vulnerable. President Johnson, he painted a picture of the Great Society with the following words, quote, "The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It's a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a feared cause of boredom and restlessness. It's a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community." Now, those words would be unusual coming from most politicians today, and I have to be quite frank that it gives me a minor sense of panic to think of the government worrying about the quality of my leisure time. The government wants to make sure you're never bored. Well, that sounds like something right out of Aldous Huxley. And it is a little bit dated, to be sure, but it's a reminder of what stimulated the modern conservative movement that was overreached by the government into areas of our lives where the government is not appropriate. That notwithstanding, the anti-poverty goals of the Great Society were laudable and they were good. The vision was something I think that we can all stand behind still today. The question is, what's happened over the past half century? What do the data say has happened in these anti-poverty lofty goals? Well, we've spent trillions of dollars on the safety net for the poor. We'll spend about $1 trillion this very year on the safety net for the poor between transfer payments and overhead. Now, that's not success. Only in DC does spending count as success on its face. Material deprivation, when we do talk about success, is way down. And health and longevity are way up. And those are wonderful things. Life is better for poor people than they were in 1964. That's mostly due to economic growth and the progress of technology, as you would probably expect. But we can plausibly credit some of those gains to safety net programs as well. The problem is that the poverty rate has not changed. In 1964, May 22nd, the poverty rate was 14.7% of the American population. Today, it's 15%. Those numbers would get any CEO in America fired 100 times over. 50 years and no change in the central metric of success in the war on poverty. The percentage of the population leaving at least one means-tested entitlement has risen from 4% in 1951 before the war on poverty to 35% today. In other words, to keep a 15% poverty rate, we have more and more and more people who are effectively being supported by the government. The percentage of men in the workforce, this is a metric that's very important for the vitality of a society. It's fallen from 81% in 1964 to 68% today. The percentage of men between the ages of 20 and 64 who are not institutionalized, who are not in the workforce, who are idle, has tripled since 1964. So let's be honest. That's not what success sounds like. That's not what success looks like. This has not been a success. Now, some good things have happened, but we need to be honest about these things because we're talking about the lives of poor people here. We're not talking about just the egos of policymakers and people who run think tanks. We're talking about millions of Americans who have been left behind, and it's been acute and worse over the past 5 years in this country. We have to face facts. There's been a 50% explosion in the uptake of food stamps since January of 2009, from 32 million Americans to 48 million Americans. We've never seen anything like this. There's been a 20% increase in disability claims. We're leaving the poor behind. We need a new set of solutions that reaches from the poor all the way to the middle class. We cannot afford to continue to be two countries. And that's what brings us here together today. I have an incredibly distinguished panel of policymakers who are talking about the most cutting-edge ideas in a new great society, in a new war on poverty. We start to my right with House Majority Leader Eric Cantor. He's represented the 7th District of the great state of Virginia in the House of Representatives since 2001. He was elected by his colleagues in the House to be the Majority Leader for the 112th Congress and again in the 113th. Before he was the Majority Leader, he was the House Minority Whip. Senator Tim Scott, on my far right. He has served the people of South Carolina in the U.S. Senate since 2013. Before he joined the Senate, he was a member of the House of Representatives, the South Carolina House of Representatives, and for many years on the Charleston City Council. And this is Senator Mike Lee from Utah. He was elected in 2010. He's made a big footprint since then. And he's known not only as a strong defender of the Constitution, as a lawyer, but as an advocate for the poorest members of our society. Now, there's a lot to talk about here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing what each of these gentlemen has to say. So I'm going to get right to it, and I'm going to start with Majority Leader Cantor. Eric, there's a lot to talk about in reform conservatism these days. You talk about it a lot. You've talked about it here and all over the country, making life work, making life better. And there's a new book, Room to Grow, and I recommend this to your interest. This is from the YG Network. This has 13 essays that lay out the future. It's a futuristic document about how to make some of these things come to life. So here's the big question. What is reform conservatism, and what are you pursuing as part of the reform conservative agenda?
Thank you. Arthur, thanks so much for hosting us here at AEI, and I want to wish you a belated happy birthday. 50 years old in one day, so welcome to the ranks. But really appreciate you being here. And, you know, if we think about it, policy making is about problem solving. And all of us who've had the privilege of being elected to public office should be about trying to address problems that the folks who elect us are facing. And you've laid out very succinctly the problems that I think our country is facing. And overwhelmingly, the indications are that the core of America, the working middle class families, are facing some serious problems. And it's about their outlook and their faith in the future, and whether that they can see a better life for themselves and their kids. And I think, as you pointed out, overwhelmingly, the signs indicate that they don't have that sense that they will enjoy upward mobility, that they don't have a sense that somehow they'll be able to make a better life for their kids. And so reform conservatism, to me, is about applying the conservative principles of individual freedom, of personal responsibility, and of making sure that we peel back the reach of government to create more space for those working middle class people in America, for the bulk of Americans, to see a better life, and apply those principles to the actual solutions. And to me, it's very helpful sometimes to think about the working family, or maybe the single mom who at the end of a hard day has put her kids to bed and then has to face how is she going to make ends meet and pay the bills at the end of the month. And it is that scenario that I think that the reform conservative movement, the solutions that come out of great thinkers like Mike Lee and Tim Scott, those scholars here at AI, can be so beneficial. So in the House, we've been about an agenda called An America That Works. And, you know, I was here 14 months ago giving a talk entitled Making Life Work. This is about helping people. As you say, this is about encouraging them, making it easier for people to pursue the happiness that was the vision of the founders of our country. So that agenda in the House is very much focused on building on the kinds of reforms that Tim Scott has been talking about on education in the secondary schools, the kinds of reforms that Mike Lee has been talking about in higher education reform. And I view my job as majority leader to help guide these kinds of ideas through the legislative process. And frankly, that's why I'm so excited about this new book, Room to Grow, and all the great ideas that are in there, because it does reflect, I think, the energy and the robust nature of what this reform conservative movement is about.
Senator Lee, you've been speaking to middle class and working poor concerns since you came to the Senate. Anybody who thinks they know what a Tea Party Republican is needs to pay attention to what you're saying, because they don't. You're really redefining a whole lot of categories. You're scrambling the notions of what it means to be a conservative Republican in all kinds of ways that I admire very much. Our second panel today is going to discuss Room to Grow a little bit more, and it features one of your bills to expand the child tax credit. Can you talk just a little bit about that and what it means and sort of morally why it matters, as opposed to just technically what it does?
Sure. First of all, just as a lead into that, I want to say that everything we do in this area, the whole purpose of the conservative reform agenda, is to emphasize an understanding expressed by Abraham Lincoln in his first big address to Congress, when he said that the purpose of government is to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, and to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. And we have to remember that of all the obstacles that Americans face, particularly working parents, poor and middle class families, some of the most insurmountable obstacles that have to be removed are put in place in the first place by dysfunctional government policies that are holding people back. And so that's really where I start when I look at this. Now, the greatest opportunities, the greatest engines of economic mobility, not to mention economic growth, are themselves the twin pillars of our society, which are our free market economy and our voluntary institutions of civil society. When those things are strong, the poor and the middle class can get ahead. We have upward economic mobility. When those things are weak, especially when they're weakened by government, those things start to atrophy and economic mobility is impaired. So you mentioned the child tax credit proposal that I have. The whole idea there is to get government out of the way, at least to have the government stop penalizing hardworking parents. Parents, in many cases, are penalized twice by our tax code. Once rather overtly and intentionally with the marriage tax penalty, but a second time with an unintended, much less well-known penalty called the parent tax penalty, where working parents are taxed effectively twice relative to our senior entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare. They pay once into the system as they work and they pay their taxes. They pay into the system a second time as they incur the rather substantial costs of raising their children. According to the USDA, it works out to about $300,000 per child. In my experience and that of many others, that's a lowball estimate. But when you raise your children, you're building the next generation of taxpayers who will be paying the Social Security and Medicare benefits of today's workers, tomorrow's retirees. Our current tax code does nothing adequately to offset this significant contribution. So when you consider two couples that have otherwise the same tax situation, the same income, the same charitable contribution pattern, the same mortgage, couple A has 4 children, couple B chooses to remain childless. Couple A will be putting into the system twice. Couple A's children will be paying taxes that will support couple B in retirement. And so this $2,500 per child tax credit starts to offset this parent tax penalty.
Just an example of one of the ideas that you're seeing coming from this group that you can read about in this book, but also you're going to be seeing more of reflected in legislation. Tim Scott, when you and I get together socially, we inevitably talk about your ideas for helping poor people. It's something that we care about a lot, and it's something that you have a lot of personal experience in. You have this incredible, inspiring life story. I mean, you've lived a lot of the things that you're talking about and trying to help people. And you're a guy who thinks for himself. You know, when people say, what is the new right? I say Google Tim Scott. This is a guy who thinks for himself. Can you talk a little bit about, just a little bit more broadly than what we've been talking about here, about what you've learned from the Great Society programs? What have they done well? What have they done poorly, and what can we learn from it? How has that molded your thinking with this new agenda that you've got?
Well, certainly, I think if you step back for a second, certainly I like to think for myself, but I've listened to you for a long time, and I've learned a lot. Number one of the most important lessons ever is that Diet Mountain Dew tastes almost as good as Mountain Dew. So when we were having lunch and you had a Diet Mountain Dew and I had a Mountain Dew, and you said, you can still drink that at your size? I mean, your age? I appreciate that very, very much. Thank you for pointing that out, Arthur. In addition to that, however, when you think about things that fail and things that work, that Diet Mountain Dew versus the Mountain Dew really does matter. So when I think about the Great Society and the objectives, they wanted it to work. They wanted it to feel good, to make a difference. If you have direct payments to seniors, you're going to reduce the poverty rate. But the fact of the matter is, for kids like me growing up in houses of Francis Scott, who was working 16 hours a day, living in the wrong zip code, it didn't work very well. And unfortunately, when you look in those same zip codes, things are getting worse. And that's part of the challenge that we face. So what we have to do is figure out how to have an education system that's not driven by zip codes. We have to figure out how to study the root and not the fruit. And so what we see so often is we'll have a conversation about the fruit, about high unemployment or high poverty rates. But the fact of the matter is, what I learned as a kid who flunked out of high school and then got it right, is that education seems to be the gateway to the American dream. And unless we're going to focus more attention on the root causes, we'll never get rid of the fruit. And so part of the challenges that I face, that so many Americans face today, is that we haven't spent enough time figuring out how to unleash the American dream in some of our strongest and poorest areas of the country. And the school choice opportunity that we have focused on really does that. So we provide real opportunities for kids trapped and mired in poverty, and it has been very successful. The DC Opportunity Scholarship really is case in point. Over the last 10 years, we've seen over 6,000 students go through the Opportunity Scholarship program, and it has produced remarkable results. Kids who don't go through the Opportunity Scholarship or have the opportunity to go to a school of their parents' choice in DC graduate about 56% of the time. Those kids who are enrolled in the DC Opportunity Scholarship graduate about 93% of the time. 91% of those kids go on to get a 2-year, 4-year college education. That breaks the intergenerational poverty that has existed for so long. And if we're going to address those great challenges, we're going to have to look at the roots. And sometimes they're pretty simple. Education and skills, 2 parts of my opportunity agenda that actually helps us eliminate poverty permanently, as opposed to having simple Band-Aids brought to you by the United States government that costs too much, delivers too little, and doesn't alleviate the ultimate pain.
Tim, one of the things I really admire is that your fundamental orientation about the poor is that they are assets, not liabilities for our country, that they're people that have value.
One of the things I do oftentimes when I speak in schools, and I speak in a school every month, I'm going to Skype in about an hour or two with a school, I always hear labels being put on poor kids, at-risk kids. What an awful label for a kid. I was an at-risk kid. The fact of the matter is we are high-potential children who have the same potential as anyone else if we are shown the right way. And the government simply can't do that. We need local control. We need parents having more choices so kids have a better chance. And when I think about that, I get pretty excited about it, because I was the kid that was flunking out of high school. I failed world geography. I'm a senator that failed civics. Think about that, Mike. I've made up for it. Well, if we go to the Senate, others have failed it too, it seems to me. But there is a great opportunity for America to embrace its highest potential folks who have oftentimes been left out of the economic chain.
Yeah. This is a point that Marco Rubio makes a lot too, and he makes it really eloquently. So this is an idea that's spread around a lot. I think it characterizes the new right in a very vital way. Another point that all three of you have made, and I've heard you make it on various occasions, is that the reason for free enterprise is not the rich. The reason for free enterprise is the poor. I mean, in a very real way, in a successful society, the rich people don't need free enterprise as much as poor people do. And that leads me to sort of the next topic. One of the things that we've been looking at a little bit at AEI is barriers to poor people availing themselves of the blessings of the free enterprise system in an increasingly complex regulatory state. And I'll give you one example. Here in Washington, D.C., and I see Tim Carney, who writes about this a lot here as an AEI scholar, here in Washington, D.C., if you want to be a real estate agent, okay, and that's a typical second job for a family when the kids have gone to school or left home, you need 135 hours of licensing, basic licensing, okay? A lot, a little, I don't know. Now, let's say you want to be a cosmetologist because you want to do nails or braid hair in your home for money, which is a typical first job for a single mom who has little kids and wants to stay home and take care of them. To do that legally, to not be shut down, to not be fined, you need 1,500 hours of licensing, 200 days in school in the District of Columbia. 135 hours to be a real estate agent, upper middle class mom, 1,500 hours to do African hair braiding. That's anti-poor and it's un-American, and we need a solution. And I think Eric's got one.
Well, I tell you, Arthur, I think that your focus on the poor and the working middle class is where this entire reform conservative movement is about. The bulk of the people in this country are not those who frankly have a college or graduate degree. They're wage earners. They're people who are feeling that this country is not there for them. And we want to restore that faith in the future. So you point out that there are way too many barriers right now to success. And the licensing question in particular is one that I think strikes at the heart of what America is about. You know, you've always talked about, Arthur, the earned success of this country, and that being the way to best pursue happiness and to earn that success and enjoy that happiness. Well, if you've got government viscerally in a place that what it does is it says we're just going to make it more difficult. I mean, if you look at young people today, the examples that are going on throughout our country, the kinds of upstarts in the economy like Uber or food trucks, the immediate reaction to government is we want to stop it. We want to make it more difficult for those kind of innovative operations to exist and thrive and grow. And you point out about a cosmetologist. In the House, we had a hearing in the Small Business Committee, and there was a lot of discussion about that. And I think on average, you're right. In D.C., maybe exaggerated, I think on average across the country, it's 372 days to become a licensed cosmetologist. But if you look at a position like an emergency medical technician, there's only 33 days required. Now, most people who don't have the higher education degree, they really deserve us to exert extra effort to tear down these barriers. So what I hope is in the House is we're going to move on that front. I intend to reach out to the governors around the country and to do an inventory of what their licensing practices are about. Let's tear down those barriers for people who want to start to get into the workforce, to create a life and a career for themselves. And the problem is the federal government is funding training programs that actually help those licensing regimes grow. We need to stop that. The incentives are wrong. And so hopefully we can do that to come down on the side of the working middle class, those individuals who don't necessarily have the higher education degrees, but make up the bulk of working middle class people and kids who want their life to be better, and that's what we're about.
Can you get Democrats to join you?
I hope so, because I think that when I was here 14 months ago, I talked a lot about skills training. I talked about what we can do for working middle class folks. And we've actually made a lot of progress, bipartisan progress, that I think a bill will make it across to the president's desk. Just as I hope the bill that we did, like Tim Scott was working on, we passed it in the House last week on school choice for those kids that Tim talks about. Maybe we can actually make some progress on that too.
For either of our senators, this is a hard question, but it's a question we need an answer to. One of the big initiatives of the White House today is one of their big answers to fixing low wages for people who can't make a living is force companies to pay them more. We want a minimum wage of 10.10, and in the State of the Union address, we learned that that's because that's an easy number to remember, which seems an odd policy rationale to me, running a think tank. But be that as it may, that's a big jump. That's like a 40% jump. We look at the data, and the CBO runs the numbers and says that's going to shave 500,000 jobs off the bottom of the workforce, the people who are most vulnerable. And we fret about that a lot, but we got to have an answer. We can't just be fighting against things, and you guys are fighting for people. So what do you say? How do we get us out of this Gordian knot? How do we fix it?
It's devastating. When you think about a 10.10 wage, taking it from 7.25 to 10.10, it's devastating to the people who are the most vulnerable on the economic chain. Think about the impact that it's already had because of the mandatory 10.10 on military bases. McDonald's, Subways have shut their doors throughout this country. We're getting calls, I'm getting letters from folks who are entrepreneurs who are looking forward to having more opportunities to work with the government because they found the dream. But now the door has been shut because you cannot mandate a 10.10 wage without unintended consequences. I heard, according to CBO, up to 900,000 lost jobs because of this additional wage. Here's what I see happening throughout the workforce. When you go from 7.25 to 10.10, you do one of three things. A, you're going to have to, as an entrepreneur or small business owner, you're going to have to raise the qualifications for that entry-level job, which means that you're going to reduce the number of low-income applicants who can apply for those jobs. Number two, you're going to quickly make the decision to automate. When you automate, you eliminate more jobs very quickly. Or number three, you're going to raise the prices on the widget or whatever is made, which means that those folks who are most vulnerable can now afford it even less. So the impact is significant. I spoke at a high school recently and had this conversation, and what I realized that it was easy to explain. You count to 5, and you say, which one of your friends, out of the 5 of you, do you want to lose their job? Because that's what happens. And interestingly enough, when you talk to enough high school kids, you realize that most of them, after a year on the job, when they're still in high school, no longer make the minimum wage because they earned a higher wage and they feel good about that.
We're going to turn to the audience in just a second, but I want to hear Mike Lee weigh in on this too. What do we do instead, Senator? Get your questions ready, folks. I'm turning to you next.
We have to remember that, first of all, the real minimum wage is zero. And you will push a lot of people to a minimum wage of zero if government artificially steps in and tries to manipulate the price, because a lot of people will just lose their jobs. And this leads to what a lot of people feel. A lot of hardworking Americans, especially in the poor and the middle class, increasingly feel that the system is rigged. It's rigged against them. And they're absolutely right. Because every time government intervenes in the free market economy, every time it involves itself excessively, either by dictating wages or through imposing excessive regulations of one sort or another, of investing government funds with friends of the government administration in charge, every time it does that, these things all inure to the benefit of large, wealthy incumbents in the marketplace. People get wealthier at the top end of the economic spectrum. And this is not what we need. What we need is instead for the government to get out of the way, for the government to allow Americans to do what they do best. And so that's why one of the things that we can do to help the poor and the middle class is to focus on an anti-cronyism agenda, one that gets the government out of the way, one that starts with getting government out of the business of things like the Export-Import Bank, of things like OPIC, where government is picking winners in the marketplace, subsidizing them heavily, or in other cases, imposing onerous regulations that make it harder for newer players to enter the marketplace. These things kill jobs, these things depress wages, and ultimately they make it harder for hardworking Americans. So if we want the poor and the middle class to be better off. We should not raise the minimum wage. We should focus on getting rid of crony capitalism, and we should focus on getting rid of excessive taxation and regulation.
Eric, do you have a comment before
Yeah,
we
Arthur,
turn?
can I just speak to the one concrete thing we could do right now to tear down the barriers, as both senators have said, is to look to repealing the rule under Obamacare that has reduced the work week from 40 to 30 hours. That's a 25% increase in someone's wage if their work week is back to 40 hours. And interestingly, if you look at the math, the numbers involved with a $10.10 minimum wage compared to the existing one, it's about a $2 per paycheck difference if you just were to repeal that rule under Obamacare. So let's repeal that rule, give people back their full work week, and not do the harm that it imposes on businesses that the CBO even says we could lose up to 500,000 jobs. That's what we can do now. We've done it in the House. And if the president were serious about wanting to help wage earners, we could do that right now.
He may be watching. We're going to turn to the audience. Please wait for the microphone and say your name and let us know where you're from. Andy, can you come up to here, the lady in red right here?
Thank you for your wonderful comments. I wanted to ask about a particular subset of the poor, and that is Americans with disabilities. For a long time, generations, there's been a real bigotry of low expectations for young people with disabilities, where they're told when they're young that they're never going to work and they're going to live on benefits. And I'm wondering if you're looking at programs that can change to an employment-first mentality so that the majority of Americans with disabilities can work. Mr. Brooks cited some important statistics about the lack of improvement. Since the ADA, there's been a 0% improvement in the percentage of Americans with disabilities who are working, so that 7 out of 10 working-age Americans with disabilities are outside of the workforce. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about expanding the American dream for Americans with disabilities?
Well, I would wholeheartedly support an effort that would improve the environment for the principle of work. I mean, that's what the country was based on. And if you can see, we have begun to do this in the area of entitlements. A lot of the discussion around the nutrition programs had to do with restoring the work requirement, saying that if someone's going to get a benefit, they at least ought to be willing to go out and try and work. If there is a job available, fine. If not, to participate in a training program, to even commit to community volunteer service if there's none of those training programs. So I think the same principle should be applied to the disability community. We should absolutely provide a pathway for those who are disabled to enjoy what our country's about, which is, again, built on the principle of work. So I look forward to looking at that further.
One of the things that we address in My Choice Act, creating hope and opportunity for individuals and communities through education, is a component for kids with special needs. We allow for the funding and education to be portable. Because one of the things that we ran into listening to the stories of parents, one child in particular, Rachel Lewis, she's now 20. When she was in the kindergarten, her parents fought to keep her in mainstream classes because she was able to do the work. But the schools, unfortunately, were not willing to do so. She was able, fortunately, to find a school in Greenville, South Carolina called Hidden Treasures. Their objective is to help make sure that the kids with special needs gets the best education suited specifically for their skill sets. By doing so, now at 20 years old, Rachel has 2 jobs, not one, but 2 jobs. And she's functioning at a very high level because she was nurtured and given the opportunity to succeed at her full potential. There's a company, I believe it's Walgreens. They're located in Anderson County in South Carolina. 40% of their workforce have special needs. But it is the most productive warehouse facility in the entire country for the chain.
Mr. Choksi, we'll wait for Emma will bring the microphone up and around. First row.
I think that's Walgreens.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Senator Lee. You talked about this child tax credit you want to put in place. This strikes me as a classic case of one government intervention, a bad one, the parent tax, being mitigated by another government intervention. Why don't you just eliminate the parent tax?
The fact is that we're living with the system that we have. We start with the system we have rather than the one that might have been had we started out differently. Our senior entitlement programs operate the way that they do. And that being the case, this is not creating another government interference. This is not creating another favored class. This is a modest effort to offset unfair treatment that one group is currently being given. And it is inevitable that they will continue to receive that unfair treatment as long as we don't do something like this. So just to be very clear, this is not a benefit we're adding to somebody. If anything, if you want to analyze this, this still doesn't adequately offset the parent tax penalty, but it is a mild offset. There are a lot of those who are benefiting from the children who are being raised by the parents who are incurring very substantial child rearing costs as they do this. Those child rearing costs are contributing to the stability of our senior entitlement programs, and that needs to be recognized by our tax code, and it's not currently.
Right here in the middle, then we'll go back to Tim Carney in the back. Mike's coming to you now.
Good morning. My name is Bill Hampton. I serve with an organization called SIL International. And I have a question that talks about education, but it talks more specifically about technical training. And as we recalibrate primary and secondary education in this country, is there some way to get back to the point where we're including the idea of technical training being a dignified way for people to graduate from high school so that they can be prepared for technical jobs, which I think right now, I think the statistic that you hear is that there's between 500,000 and 1 million unfilled technical jobs in this country. And I wonder if, as we recalibrate the education system in this country, if that could be included in the thinking and the design.
If I could, I know Tim says he's got something as well. To respond to that, I've spent some time in my district in Virginia and elsewhere throughout the Commonwealth looking at apprenticeship programs, looking at ways for kids to find a career path if going to get a 4-year degree is not for them. And in fact, tomorrow I will be in Charlotte, North Carolina with another apprenticeship program by the county there. So I think you're exactly right. We need to be about providing pathways for careers. We need to tear down those barriers. And one of the problems, and I know Mike has talked a lot about the higher ed dilemma with the increasing cost of tuition, the desire for folks to undertake a lot of student debt and loans. They finish their college 4 years. Their major is not one that perhaps allows them to seek a job that could allow them to go out on their own, repay their debts, and they end up as kids going back to live with their parents again. Meanwhile, we've got some great programs with kids coming out of school partnering with business and apprenticeship programs so they could find themselves perhaps after 4 or 5 years graduating from high school in a technical position that will allow them to make over $100,000 a year. We need freedom of choice in terms of career path. We should not be insisting one way or the other is better. And so I think that you will see us in the House this year. Not only are we going to be taking up the Higher Ed Reauthorization Act and doing some of the things that Senator Lee's been talking about, but we will be also looking at the Perkins vocational programs and reauthorization activity there as well.
Some of the things that we've seen succeed, especially back when I was in high school, we had CHOP. So there was a dual track in education that we seem to have lost half of our way forward. So we've oversold the importance of a 4-year education and undersold the real opportunity of the second part of the track, which is SHOP. The Skills Act, something that we really took from the House through Eric's leadership and brought to the Senate and worked on diligently for the last 6 months, really allows for more training dollars to end up in technical schools or job training centers so that we could have a dual track. Boeing, the company that is located in my state of South Carolina, they say that they're going to have a massive shortage in aerospace for machinists because there's been such a focus outside of the jobs that pay really well but doesn't necessarily require the college education. So what we're trying to do is focus on reinstituting this notion of a dual track in the next iteration of the ESEA reauthorization. It would be a fantastic or as opposed to and in education.
Like Mr. Cantor mentioned briefly my Higher Education Reform Act. I thought I should just summarize that briefly because that ties in to the question here. The idea behind this is to give states the option of creating their own alternative accreditation system for higher education purposes, such that students could participate in Title IV federal funding while participating in a higher education experience that's accredited outside of the traditional U.S. Department of Education supervised accreditation system. The purpose of this is to allow for more people to have access to vocational training in some cases, in other cases massive open online courses. There is a lot that can be learned by a lot of students that could benefit them and put them on a career path that falls outside of the traditional brick and ivy institution, the traditional four-year institution. There's always going to be a place for those institutions. But in our information age economy, where one's access to the middle class, one's access to the economic ladder depends on one's education, we need to increase the number of providers of higher education. And as we do that, we'll see the prices go down. We'll see the cost of tuition go down. We'll see more people having more of a chance.
Tim Carney from AEI and the Washington Examiner.
Thank you. I love lifting the artificial weights from the shoulders and removing the barriers to entry and all, but doesn't that address only half the problem? Rick Santorum says, while rising tide lifts all boats, it doesn't lift the boats that have holes in them. So educate kids, but there's already people, the 25-year-old who had a horrible education, and improving economy and more opportunities to start a food truck aren't necessarily going to help him. Or the 50-year-old guy who just got laid off from his factory that closed down, who doesn't have the skills. Is there a lot of the emphasis is the good free enterprise stuff to create the opportunities, but does there need to be more emphasis on the people whose boats have holes in them and who tearing down the barriers to entry isn't going to necessarily open up opportunities for?
What I would say, Tim, is I think if you look at the numbers where the chronically unemployed are overrepresented, it is those individuals who lack the skills necessary for the opportunities of the jobs today. And one of the items that, again, we talked about 14 months ago here that we've actually made bipartisan progress on, and agreement has been reached, House and Senate, is the Skills Act. It is trying to consolidate the federal dollars that go into worker training programs to make it easier. Make there a one-stop shop for somebody who is in a situation where their background, their skill set is not suited for a career for them to take off and to rise. So it's true. We've got to do all of this. We've got to create the environment for people to succeed. And that starts with tearing down the barriers. And in these workforce training programs, there's a lot of vested interests out there that create so much difficulty and understanding for someone to even go to a community college or somewhere else that's a recipient of these monies to even get some progress so that they can be marketable and get a job and have a career. So it's tearing down barriers. At that level, it is creating the opportunity for an entrepreneur, for the next Uber inventor to do his or her job as well and pursue their dreams by getting government out of the way.
The last question in this session, we're going to go to the next session, but the last question of this session goes to Juliana Glover.
Hi, my name is Juliana Glover. I'm with Teneo Strategies. My question has to do specifically with Skills and Workforce Investment Act. Congresswoman Brooks included in, I can't recall whether it was workforce investment or skills, language that provides for governors to opt in to a pay-for-performance job training program. The Senate version that I think is about to be unveiled shortly allows governors to use up to 10% of their WIA funds for pay-for-performance job training programs. Those types of programs, as you all know, do not reimburse the various nonprofits and government programs that work at the federal level unless individuals get jobs and, for example, not just keep jobs, but also deliver a W-2 to that job training program a year later showing that they got a job and kept a job. Can you all talk a little bit about what you're hearing and seeing about pay for performance among your constituents, or where this is?
Listen, Julian, I can respond to that by saying accountability is what we're after. We want programs that work. We want to make folks' life work better. And if the test is federal dollars going to states for programs that don't work or work, we'd much rather them work. So I am very much in favor of creating those kind of incentives. And it's hard. I mean, it's like the school choice movement. It's charter schools. It's very difficult for the establishment to accept that, frankly, there needs to be a grade. There needs to be a system by which we succeed, not just by existing. So I'd be very much in favor of those kind of incentives. And the Skills Act, WIA sort of agreement that is now underway in both the House and Senate, I think does reflect the first step towards that end.
We've come to the end of this session, and my closing comment is simply this. We've talked an awful lot about the what of better policies for the next 50 years of trying to solve many of this country's poverty problems that have seemed intractable, but let's remember the why. Each one of us here up on this stage, and most of you in this audience, are angry enough to fight for better policy, but that's not our question. The question is whether or not we have enough love in our hearts for every American to fight for better policy. These gentlemen do, and the reason they're leaving now is to go back into battle. Please join me in thanking them. Don't go anyplace, folks. No time for a bathroom break, because the fun continues. It's my honor now to introduce the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell. No stranger to any of you who hang out at AEI. He's given many important policy addresses here over the past 2 years, and he's got one today that you're not going to want to miss. He's going to offer a few remarks on the role of the Senate in advancing solutions now, particularly for the middle class. Why? Why the middle class? The middle class has a unique and important moral role in the fiber of this nation. Not because being middle class per se is inherently important, but because it's an aspirational goal that's almost unique to the way the United States has been formed. Most Americans, whether they're middle class or not, think they're middle class. That's the kind of aspiration that does not, as many on the in the mainstream media will tell you, reflect delusion, but one that really does reflect aspiration. If we don't serve that aspiration, we will lose that aspiration. That's something that matters a lot to Mitch McConnell. As most of you know, he serves the people of Kentucky in his 5th term in the U.S. Senate, soon to be reelected for a 6th term to the U.S. Senate for Kentucky. He just won a big primary victory, and I'm sure he's pleased about that, as are many of you and certainly me. Senator McConnell has been to AEI to speak many times, and we're delighted to hear from him. His insights and practical solutions to problems inspire us to new policy ideas and for our work. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitch McConnell.
Good morning. Well, I'm happy to be here, especially under the present circumstances. If things had turned out differently in Kentucky Tuesday, this could have been a fairly awkward presentation. Let me start by thanking Arthur and AEI for us and for co-sponsoring today's conference, as well as our other co-sponsors, National Affairs and the YG Network. Earlier this year, Senate Republicans hosted a number of today's panelists at our annual retreat. So in some sense, I view today as a continuation of a conversation that's already ongoing. A conversation about our shared commitment to the urgent task of alleviating the burdens of the working poor and the American middle class. Thanks for the opportunity to share some observations of my own on the role that a Senate led by Republicans might play in making this important goal a reality. Broadly speaking, I think there are two basic arguments hovering over us this morning. The first argument is that the various policy proposals we now commonly refer to as reform conservatism represent a good initial answer to the question of how government can be used to help, not hurt, working Americans across the country whose wages have remained stubbornly flat throughout the Obama era, even as the cost of everything from college tuition to health care continues to rise. Many of these Americans have come to feel that their government is now working against them, not for them. And reform conservatism is animated in large part by a desire to prove that at least one party in Washington remains determined to change that, and to show in the process that today's Republican Party has something to offer those Americans beyond a mere rejection of what the other side is selling. After all, the Constitution isn't merely a limiting document, though it is that indeed. It is also meant to enable action, to facilitate commerce, mobility, and greater opportunity, to enrich our lives and our society as the nation grows and develops. This is something two of my Kentucky forebears, Abraham Lincoln and Henry Clay, well understood. And it's well worth remembering even as we steadfastly reaffirm government's proper limits. Second argument, repeated with great frequency by some of our panelists, is that embracing these various reform proposals and touting them on the campaign trail would go a long way toward alleviating the much discussed electoral struggles of today's Republican Party. So let me just say at the outset that I think there's very little to dispute in either one of these claims. I think that if you were to ask any Republicans in Washington which group of Americans stands to benefit the most from the ideas and ideals of our party, they'd respond without hesitation, it's the American middle class. And that any suggestion to the contrary is based on a cheap and dishonest caricature. And yet I think it must also be admitted that in our rush to defend the American entrepreneur from daily depredations of an administration that seems to view any profit-making enterprise with deep suspicion, they have often lost sight of the fact that our average voter is not John Galt. It's a good impulse, to be sure. But for most Americans whose daily concerns revolve around aging parents, long commutes, shrinking budgets, and obscenely high tuition bills, these hymns to entrepreneurism are, as a practical matter, largely irrelevant. And the audience for them is probably a lot smaller than we think. So I do think we do well as a party to get down to the basics. I see Mona Charen out there. This is the way she recently put it. Let's talk less of job creators and more talk of job earners would be welcome. Very astute observation. Having said that, I think a politician's personal appeal and overall electability continue to be as potent a force in American politics as a well-considered policy platform. But that's a larger conversation and one we'll leave for another day. Today isn't primarily about tactics. It's about our shared commitment to making life a little easier for the working poor and for the broad American middle class through concrete policies. And it's about recognizing how fortunate we are as a party to have so many thoughtful and creative women and men contributing their energies and talents to this vitally important movement of ideas. Yuval Levin often speaks about the importance of gratitude, and it is with no little gratitude that I want to acknowledge this morning the tremendous work that so many of you have done in preparing us for the day the American people realize, once again, that liberalism simply doesn't work. And Republicans are once again driving the policy debate in Washington. Thanks to you and to others, we will be well armed when that happy day finally arrives. I hope sooner rather than later. I'm proud that several members of my conference have thrown themselves into this movement with enthusiasm. I'm grateful for their efforts as well. James Madison once said that the U.S. Constitution was the work of many heads and many hands. And the same could be justly said of this great collective effort to update our party's ideas consistent with its longstanding principles of upward mobility, shared responsibility for the weak, and a strong but limited government. For my part, I've pressed for legislation in recent months that addresses a variety of concerns to the voters of my state. For example, the Family Friendly and Workforce Flexibility Act, which I introduced along with Senator Ayotte, would allow working mothers to enter into a voluntary agreement with their employer whereby they would be able to bank overtime compensation in the form of time off rather than more pay. The Expanding Opportunity Through Quality Charter Schools Act would provide more and better educational choices to families who've made it very clear to me how disappointed they are in their current options and how frustrated they are with teachers' unions that block any progress. And then there's the National Right to Work Act, a bill I've co-sponsored with Senator Paul, which would eliminate a federal rule that requires the employees of certain companies to join a union or pay union dues whether they want to or not. Lifting this rule would vastly increase job opportunities in my state for women and men who want work but just can't find it, especially in the area of manufacturing. So these are just a few of the ideas. Senators Lee and Rubio and Scott and Paul, among others, have outlined numerous other specific proposals with similar goals in mind. We won't all agree, of course, on the particulars of every single proposal, and we may disagree on the political wisdom of pursuing various proposals at particular times and places, but that's okay. The idea isn't to agree on everything, it's to have a serious debate that leads to good, durable results. Now, this debate, my friends, is already underway. I believe it is a powerful sign of our strength and vitality as a party, and it points to an inherent advantage we have always had over Democrats in the battle of ideas. As a coalition party, today's Democrats simply don't have room to innovate or to keep pace with the times. That's why they seem to have been pushing the same ideas for more than a century now. They're captive to a handful of interest groups that just won't allow them to think big or innovatively. Occasionally, they'll try to make a virtue of necessity by casting their commitment to a century-old agenda as a sign of their doggedness. But the truth is, they're simply trapped. It's been left to us to fill the gaps. In a recent interview with Stephen Colbert, George Will noted that liking things that are old doesn't make you a conservative, it makes you a liberal. His point wasn't to suggest that conservatives have given up on preserving institutions that are working as they should. It was to highlight how often liberals won't even discuss updating or reforming those that aren't. Liberals will always react to such a claim, of course, with the swift construction of a straw man. Just hint at the need to update an existing program, and they'll claim it's the camel's nose. How many times have you heard this? The camel's nose under the tent, or a dog whistle, or a slippery slope, or whatever other metaphor they can think of to deflect any serious debate. And that's why, as people who care deeply about the future of our country, we must never tire of pointing out that the only party that has any credibility whatsoever when it comes to preserving what is good about government is ours, because we're the only ones who've actually shown an interest in really doing so. Nor should we ever tire of repeating, as Arthur often reminds us, that the people who stand to suffer the most from the collapse of our most necessary or vital programs are the very people they were originally intended to help, the poor and the marginalized. Many articles have been written and many panels convened on the question of whether the ambitious social goals that LBJ first outlined in that famous speech in Ann Arbor 50 years ago have, on balance, been helped or hindered by the multitude of initiatives that it spurned. It's a complex question, and I don't intend to add anything new on that particular debate today. But in closing, I'd like to leave you with two thoughts about the prospects of your own labors. First, I think it's important to note that the fate of any reform agenda depends not just on the composition of the Senate, but also the style of the person who leads it. LBJ's reign as Senate Majority Leader offers history a rather vivid illustration of this, and so does Harry Reid's. Limiting my comments to the latter. I don't mind saying that Senator Reid has done tremendous damage to the Senate. Tremendous damage to the Senate. By arrogating to himself powers that have traditionally resided with committees and individual members, he's turned the Senate into a graveyard of good ideas and serious, open debate. His propensity to block amendments, even on his own side, has prevented for years the organic development of policy that has always characterized the Senate at its best. Let me give you two statistics that really illustrate how bad it is. You may have heard recently Republicans pointing out that we had had 9 roll call votes since last July. Senator Barrasso checked this week to see how many Democratic roll call votes had been since July. They've had 7. Nobody's ideas are being given a hearing, a debate on the Senate floor. Some of you have suggested, and it's certainly the case, it looks like the Senate has turned into the House and the House has turned into the Senate. Speaker Boehner has given the minority in the House during this same period of time 136 roll call votes. This is not the way the Senate was operated at any point in its past, even under what some would argue the most tyrannical majority leader of ever, LBJ. So, he has muzzled the people's representatives, and through them, the people themselves. He's opted for secrecy over transparency by moving the bill writing process from the Senate floor into his conference room. Most notoriously, of course, we all recall, in the drafting of Obamacare. And I don't need to tell any of you what he has done to the spirit of comedy and respect that the public has every right to expect from their leaders. If Republicans were fortunate enough to reclaim the majority in November, I assure you, my friends, all of this would change. The Senate majority under my leadership would break sharply from the practices of the Reid era in favor of a far more freewheeling approach to problem solving. I would work to restore its traditional role as a place where good ideas are generated, debated, and voted upon. We'd fire up the committee process. And by the way, when I say that, I mean Democratic ideas too. I don't know what they're afraid of. You know, what are they afraid of? They got 55 votes. This isn't the way the Senate used to operate. When we were the majority, I used to tell my members, the price of being in the majority is you have to give the minority votes that you're not going to like in order to get the bill across the floor. That's always the way it was. We'd work longer days and weeks using the clock to force consensus. Let me touch on that for a minute. If the leader brings up a bill on Monday and really wants to finish it, the fatigue factor is the best tool you have. Rather than trying to shut everybody out and making everybody mad, you just run the clock. And you say on Monday we're going to finish this bill either Thursday night, Friday morning, Friday night, Friday night or Saturday morning. And what happens is the hour gets later and later on Thursday, amendments start disappearing. And the thought of what they have scheduled, Friday noon or Friday night, produces an incredible consensus to try to finish. But if you're tested, you have to mean it. None of which shuts anybody out. Amendments go away because people get tired. And nobody's bitter about it because they voluntarily gave up, confronted with the choice between staying up late on Thursday night and keeping your previously announced schedule, you decide on balance, I'll offer that amendment some other time. We never burn the clock. We never use the exhaustion factor. I guarantee you these are things that can and will change because one person can change most of the problems in the Senate. And that's whoever the majority leader is, the person who gets to set the agenda, has the right of prior recognition and has the opportunity to decide whether you're going to apply a gag rule to everybody or whether you're going to use tactics that create a greater level of comedy and, of course, get more results. Now, this approach would lead to its own frustrations. Members who have good ideas of their own may or may not like going through the committee process or allowing amendments to their otherwise pristine proposals. But after castigating Senator Reid for crowding out the rest of us and shielding his actions from public view, I assure you we're not going to turn around and do the same thing. There's not a chance that we're going to turn around and do the same thing. And I'll have, members who will say, gee, I wish we didn't have to vote on this or that. And my answer will be, you came to the Senate to cast votes. And most of the members who used to be in the House who came to the Senate came for that very reason, because it was much more open to ideas from all different points of view. And typically, although Boehner's operated very differently, as I just pointed out, but typically in the House, if you were in the minority, you just sort of sat down and shut up and didn't get to do anything. So people would come over to the Senate from the House and think they were free at last. And by God, under Reid, it's just like it used to be in the House. So this is correctable. It doesn't require any rules changes. It's a behavioral issue. It can change, and I will change it if the American people give me the opportunity to. Now look, the greatest way to ensure transparency is to do exactly what I said, reinvigorate the committees and restore what we used to call the regular order. The greatest way to ensure stability in our laws is to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in some way in the passage. So I think there's no question that a Republican Senate would be a far more hospitable place for the consideration of the kind of creative policy proposals that you've all been writing and thinking about. But I would remind you that the Senate is by nature and by design an extremely frustrating institution. You remember what Washington, according to legend, said the Senate would be like. He said it's going to be like the saucer under the coffee cup. The coffee, he may have said tea, I'm not sure it was coffee yet, going to slosh out of the cup down into the saucer and cool off. So it was always anticipated that it was going to be harder to do stuff in the Senate than in the House. And that could be the case again, because, as you all know, it requires 60 votes to do most things in the Senate. I believe it is the case that my party has not had more than 55 Republican senators in 100 years. They had a hammerlock on the place during the New Deal, a hammerlock on the place during the Great Society, and a hammerlock on the place the first 2 years under Barack Obama. So, we haven't been given that opportunity by the American people for a very, very long time. So don't assume that everything we want to do can get 60 votes. This is still going to be a challenging experience, but it is important to be able to set the agenda. The majority leader can set the agenda. He can decide what we're going to talk about. We wouldn't be talking about most of the things that we've been talking about here recently. All these job-killing proposals that don't do anything to benefit middle-class people. We will, regardless of what happens in November, have to deal with the government the American people have given us. And it's almost certainly not going to be 60 Republican senators. So, how do you deal with a Senate in which you don't have, at least on paper, enough members to get to 60? And that's where you come in. It's the power of your ideas. If they're attractive enough, hopefully we will be able to get at least a reasonable number of Democrats to say this is such a good idea that I'm simply not going to participate in an effort to prevent its passage. So let me thank you for the work you've already done on that necessary work of persuasion. We're going to need all the arguments you've got, even if we're in the majority, because we're certainly not going to have 60. And I think ideas are powerful things. It was Margaret Thatcher who said first you win the argument and then you win the election. So I want to thank you for helping us reinvigorate the conservative movement and to be ready to govern if in fact the American people give us that opportunity. Thanks for being here. For letting me be here.
We have a minute or two before the senator has to go back to the Hill, and that means one or two questions, and we'll start. First hand I saw is right back here. First come, first served.
Thank you, Senator McConnell. You imply in your remarks that you would not consider doing away with the filibuster if you were given the privilege of leading the Senate again. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the supermajority requirement in the Senate's been important to the country. It is, of course, more frustrating when you're in the majority but short of 60. But if you think back over the history of the country, I think probably the biggest service the Senate's provided to America is the things it has not passed. Some of the proudest moments I can think of in my own career have been the things that I stopped rather than the other. So the ability to require the kind of consensus you need to have when you have to have 60 votes, I think is important, be it ever so frustrating when you're setting the agenda and still can't get to 60. If you could kind of detach yourself from the momentary problem you have with that and look at it in terms of what I think the Senate's done for America, I think it's important not to change that fundamental role. Now, you know, Reed did a lot of damage. I take you back to the nuclear option. What was the worst thing he did was how he did it. They basically changed the rules of the Senate by breaking the rules of the Senate. What he did was called by the parliamentarian a violation of Senate rules. He appealed the chair, ruling of the chair, and overturned it with 51 votes. What they did substantively was to lower the threshold for nominations for the executive branch and for judiciary, except for the Supreme Court, to 51. But more importantly than that was how they did it. That precedent will always be there. It's hard to unring a bell, and I think was very damaging to the institution, which leads to probably what you'd like me to respond to, which I'm not going to do today, which is what would we do about that were we in the majority? And my advice to my colleagues has been that's a discussion for December. If we are fortunate enough to be given by the American people the opportunity to set the agenda in the Senate, then we'll address that question. But your question was about legislation, I assume, not about executive branch appointments. I do not favor turning the Senate into a majoritarian institution, even though we would probably have some short-term advantage from doing it.
Last question, right here in the middle.
Okay, you hold it? All right. Mr. Minority Leader, I was wondering, speaking of procedural fights, how do you see the amendment fight on the Senate extenders package playing out?
The what?
The tax extenders package, sir.
Well, hopefully it will be open for amendment, which gets back to the gag rule that the majority leaders frequently employed. The extender package enjoys considerable support, not unanimous, but considerable support But what Senate Republicans are insisting on is that it be open for amendment. And you might be interested to know there were 40 Democratic amendments filed, which would also not be considered on this tax bill. So I hope you're not bored by a discussion of process, but process is important. I mean, how you deal with something has a heck of a lot to do with what kind of an outcome you get. So I deal with process every day. It's been actually a lot simpler than it used to be, because typically what's happened, bills are brought up, the gag rule is imposed, nobody gets any amendments, and then when we rebel against that and don't pass the bill, he calls it a filibuster. The president said we'd engaged in 500 filibusters. I think Glenn Kessler gave him 4 Pinocchios for that. I think it's pretty clear these people will do and say anything in order to cling to power. And we're going to see this November whether the American people are sick and tired of this. The only thing that can be achieved, I always say to my folks in Kentucky, and I say in other audiences around the country, if you're frustrated by the last 6 years, the only thing that can be done in 2014 is to change the Senate. Nothing else is achievable in 2014 but to change the Senate and begin to change America by changing the agenda in the Senate. So that's where we are. But look, I don't want to be, I'll end with this, because Arthur is clearly getting nervous here. There was that old movie in 1972 called The Candidate. Some of you are too young to have seen it at the time, but may have seen it since, featuring Robert Redford. He was a bright new candidate who went out and won the election. And I think the movie ended when he looked to his campaign manager and he said, "What do we do now?" You all are helping us answer the question, what do we do now? If we are given the responsibility to govern, what do we do now? And for that, I really want to thank you for applying your creative minds to this challenge. And we look forward to being able to advance an agenda that we think is in the best interest of our country. Thanks so much.
We're not done yet. There's more to come. We have an all-star panel to discuss the things that we've been talking about. Solutions to poverty, solutions to building a better middle class, the world of ideas, and the happy war for the American people. Cato Byrne is going to be running our next panel. Cato Byrne from the YG Network, and it is a great panel. Rouse Douthat from the New York Times, Yuval Levin from National Affairs and the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Ramesh Ponnuru from right here at AEI and National Review Magazine, Raihan Salam from the YG Network, and Pete Weiner from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I'm going to turn it over to Cato Byrne.
Is going to be talking specifically about the policy proposals in Room to Grow, the agenda that's being unveiled today. We have both contributors to the project and observers whose reactions we'd like to hear. I'll very briefly introduce this panel because so many of them are well known to you, but for the uninitiated, Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at National Review, a fellow here at the AEI, a visiting fellow, and a columnist for Bloomberg View. Ross Douthat, of course, is with the New York Times. Yuval Levin is editor of National Affairs, our co-host for this morning's program, and a Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Raihan Salam, an awful lot of people want a piece of Raihan. He's a columnist at NRO, a contributor at Slate and CNN, and he's been advising YG Network. And Pete Weiner is also a fellow at Ethics and Public Policy and is a veteran of the past 3 Republican administrations. I thought I would ask short leading questions of each one of our panelists and get their quick responses and then leave time for questions from this audience. Let me begin with Pete Weiner. Pete, who are the middle class and why an agenda focused on the middle class?
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Kate. It's a pleasure to be with you. All right. Is that on? People here? Good. People to my right are going to deal with political philosophy and public policy. I'm going to deal with some of the less high-minded stuff, which is semantics and polling. So to deal with directly with Kate's question, who's the middle class, there's a technical and there's a practical answer to that. The technical answer, people making somewhere between $39,000 and $118,000 a year. The practical definition is practically everybody is part of the middle class. Everybody in the audience probably considers yourself a member of the middle class. People up here do as well. 85% of Americans consider themselves as part of an expanded definition of the middle class, which is lower, upper, or just simply middle class. It's basically people who don't consider themselves rich and they don't consider themselves poor, and they can imagine their fortunes going either way. So that's who we're dealing with. As to why to focus an agenda on them, because we're talking about the broad base of the country, and any successful political party or political movement needs to be seen as addressing their concerns. And frankly, that's not happening right now. I just wanted to touch on several takeaways that I had from some of the work that I did for this book, Room to Grow. One is that the dominant mood of the middle class is anxiety, insecurity, and unease. And they have reason to be that way. In the last decade and a half, they're working harder, more hours, but wages are stagnant. And the cost of living, especially in healthcare and higher education, has gone way up. So they're working harder and they're losing ground. Secondly, the middle class is increasingly pessimistic. 2/3 of Americans think it's harder to reach the American dream than it was for their parents, and 3/4 think that it's going to be harder for their children and grandchildren to succeed. Third, who does the middle class hold responsible for the problems that they face? Short answer is the political class. Fully 62% put a lot of the blame on Congress. That's followed by banks and financial institutions and corporations. So Congress is viewed institutionally as the biggest problem and biggest obstacle to what they want. Fourth, finally, the news is particularly bleak for the Republican Party. Whether you like it or not, the middle class is more likely to say the Democrats rather than Republicans favor their interests. A few data points: 62% of those in the middle class say the Republican Party favors the rich. 16% say that of the Democratic Party. 37% of those in the middle class say the Democratic Party favors the middle class. 26% say the Republican Party does. And then this one, when asked which groups are helping the middle class, 17% had a positive response to Republican elected officials. 46% were negative. So the challenge for the GOP is to explain how a conservative vision of government can speak to today's public concerns, and then to explain how that kind of vision would translate into concrete policies that would actually improve important areas of our national life. That's really what this book attempts to answer. And for some of those answers, I will turn to Raihan.
Well, let me ask Yuval first. Before we get to specific policy proposals, conservatives, Yuval, certainly agree that the government is way too big and too intrusive. So what's its proper role in addressing the anxieties and ambitions of the middle class?
Well, first of all, thank you, Kate, and thanks to AEI and YG. I like the way you put the question, because I think that thinking about it in terms of the role of government helps us to avoid the trap we often fall into of starting immediately only with the size of government before thinking about the role of government. And so basically ending up in an argument about how big the liberal welfare state should be, which too often is where we've ended up, and which is certainly the wrong argument to have. I think this book shows that a conservative governing vision, which would certainly lead us, among other things, to a leaner and less costly and more effective government, begins with a different idea of what government should be, not just of how much it should cost. And the core of that idea, in the broadest sense, I think, is that beyond national defense and public safety, government exists to enable society to better address its problems, which is an important role, but a supporting role, supportive of the role of families, of the role of communities, of the role of civil society, of the role of markets. Government exists to strengthen the space in which these social institutions can thrive, the space between the individual and the state, and to help people benefit from what they do. That means that government exists not to administer society, but to empower people to meet the challenges that they face. And that's in contrast to a vision that is common on the left that says government exists to manage society, to run the key institutions, to organize the distribution of resources, to tell people what their place and function ought to be. I think that's a very misguided idea of the role of government, and it's also one that doesn't work very well and is more and more out of step with the realities of American life. So it's a difference between a bottom-up and a top-down idea of American life, and that rather than, in a sense, it's a rather theoretical difference, but it turns out, I think, to translate into some very practical differences about how to solve problems between left and right, which also get, therefore, at the role of government. Conservatives tend to think that society can't really be run from the center, that no one has the knowledge to solve big social problems in a technical or a technocratic way. And instead, those problems have to be addressed from the bottom up through a kind of learning process that follows a series of steps that we can think of as the 3 E's: experimentation, evaluation, and evolution. What that really means is that to meet a need or deal with a problem, we first let people try different ways of addressing it. We let consumers or citizens choose from among those ways. We keep the ones that work, we drop the ones that fail. It's fairly straightforward, but it's a sort of process that is the way in which we make ongoing incremental progress towards solving complicated problems. And that's what government should help facilitate. That is often how markets work, by creating a huge incentive for providers to try different things, by letting consumers choose, by letting failures fail. And that's why conservatives often talk in terms of more market-oriented solutions. Not always simply markets, but many times markets, but always this process of solving problems, this incremental way of dealing with complicated problems. Obviously, that's not how government works for the most part today. Options are limited by a prescriptive bureaucratic way of thinking about goals. The recipients of services don't make choices, and failures never go away. A lot of what people are calling the conservative reform agenda basically involves moving from that welfare state model to more like a market-oriented model, so that the role of government would be to enable that kind of problem solving, to enable society to do what it does, rather than to try to stand in for it. Sometimes that means setting goals and letting providers compete. Sometimes it means creating the conditions for competition, making sure that it's fair. Sometimes it means providing people with information about their options. Sometimes it means helping poor or vulnerable people have the resources or the market power to participate as consumers. It means rather than using government to substitute for that process that's at the core of so much of what American society does well and just running things from the center, instead using government to facilitate that process, which gives people more options, more freedom, more control, a better chance to find actual solutions in an ongoing way. That's a lot of what conservatives have always had to offer. That's what school choice is about. It's what the conservative approach to healthcare today is about. It's what the approach to higher ed is about. It's how we think about some of the elements of the welfare system: facilitation rather than administration, a supporting role, where possible creating a competitive system for delivering services rather than having government do it directly, and in every instance removing burdens, freeing up resources and options for families rather than trying to do everything on their behalf. Everything in this book is an example of that. And given where we're starting, that means that a lot of what conservatives want to do is eliminating or repealing or taking away a lot of what the federal government is doing wrong now. But I think it's also very important to see what we want to do instead, which is helping American society function the way that it has always sought to function, the way that our constitutional system wants to function. At the core of these kinds of proposals is exactly a way of thinking about the role of government, a way of thinking that's at once both much more modern and effective and suited to the 21st century, but also at the same time a much more traditionally American idea of the relationship between the citizen and the state.
Thank you, Yuval. Ramesh, speaking of helping people, what should conservatives be saying about inequality, and is this agenda relevant to that debate?
Well, I don't think that conservatives should be saying a lot about inequality. I think that that would be a mistake, that conservatives should change the subject to things that are more substantively and politically important than inequality. On the political front, the thing that just always struck me about this debate is just what a low salience concern inequality is. If you ask people what issues concern them, Gallup has done this for years and years. Basically, if the president has been talking about inequality for 2 months straight, you can get that number, the number of people who say inequality is their top concern, all the way up to 4%. I'm guessing, at least I strongly suspect that 4% is not composed mostly of people who are persuadable by conservative ideas. I think that the evidence suggests that people are a lot more concerned by the kinds of cost of living issues that our book talks about. If you look at the evidence that Pete lays out in his introductory chapter in the book about why people feel as though they're kind of running in place, it's because of the costs of some high-ticket items that are very important to their future of their families: the cost of raising kids, the cost of energy, the cost of higher education, the cost of health care. And these are all things that we can tackle with conservative reforms. Some of those reforms might reduce inequality, some of them might increase them, a bunch of them might leave it basically unchanged. But I think that what they will do is help create the conditions for a broad-based prosperity. And that's what we ought to be thinking about. We should be concerned about how people at the bottom of the income distribution and people in the middle of the income distribution are doing, but I don't think it is particularly fruitful to conceive of that in terms of economic inequality. And that, in a way, a political opportunity is opened up by the fact that the contemporary left is so obsessed about this question that is just not a pressing concern for most middle-class Americans.
Ross, a final general question. Might conservatives hope, do you think conservatives can hope that an agenda like this has the potential to shrink government?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for including me. Since I'm not one of the co-authors featured in the book, I'm free to stand outside it, attack it, launch a schism in reform conservatism right here and right now, and that's what I'm planning to do. No, but I guess I'll make a sort of a semi-pessimistic case in a way, which is that I think that in part this is an agenda that conservatives can look to in the hopes of substantially restraining the growth of government, and that in certain ways is, and that's obviously a more pessimistic frame than how can we have an agenda to substantially reduce the size and scope of government. But I think that it is useful to recognize, both as sort of a political and a policy matter, that what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years in American life has in fact shrunk the natural constituency for conservative ideas. That a lot of the trends that I think inform a lot of the essays in this book, wage stagnation, family breakdown, the sort of social crisis in lower middle class America that Charles Murray, among many others, had written eloquently about, all of those forces have tended to undercut the building blocks of limited government conservatism. The institutions that Yuval was talking about, the mediating institutions between the state and the individual, the church, the family, the voluntary organization, and so on. And they've created a situation in which many, many Americans feel in their own lives as though they need not just the existing government, but a larger welfare state. And that is sort of the political challenge, obviously, that the Republican Party in particular has dealt with unsuccessfully in the last 2 presidential election cycles. But going forward, it's just a sort of basic policy problem for conservatives, that for limited government conservatism to persist in American life, and for American exceptionalism, which I think is integrally bound up in a sort of more limited conception of government than you see elsewhere in the Western world, for American exceptionalism to persist, you need a broad base of support for those ideas. And to have a broad base of support for those ideas, you need to have a large percentage of Americans who feel like the system is working for them. And so in a sense, there's an element of almost triage, I think. And again, this is the pessimistic frame, but triage in what some of these proposals are trying to tackle, particularly in terms of how they look at sort of the struggles of families raising children, of, you know, the less educated, downwardly mobile, working class men who are getting detached from the workforce and so on. There's a sense in which some of these policy proposals are targeted towards populations that would have been Republican or conservative constituencies in the past, are on the verge of becoming Democratic and liberal constituencies for the foreseeable future. And this is, I think, in sort of from a traditional conservative perspective, probably the most controversial part, and I think you could hear some of it in some of the skeptical questions that Senator Lee received about sort of family-friendly tax policy and so on. But because there is an element, obviously, of sort of, you know, you've all talked about directing resources. There's an element of directing resources towards the sort of intertwined areas of work and family. And I think that this, in a certain way, the strongest case for doing that kind of resource direction, for trying to help people who are working, helping work pay, and helping people who are trying to raise kids, is that if you don't do it, you won't have a constituency for limited government conservatism at all in 20 years. So that, yeah, I suppose that's the sort of grim but hopefully somewhat realistic way of looking at it, which might be useful to think about.
Thank you, Ross. I think.
We think.
Ryan, I'm going to give you an added burden, calling you as so many others do, give you a little double duty here, if I might. Please feel free to react to anything your fellow panelists have said. And when it comes to the agenda, I would love you to react specifically to the higher ed reforms. Do they really hold the promise, the kinds of reforms talked about here, to reduce cost, reduce debt, and maybe improve quality?
So I'll start on a personal note to say that, you know, I had the good fortune to finish college, and I was able to finish without too much debt because the whole time I was growing up, both of my parents worked 2 jobs, and and every moment I got to spend with them was precious because they were both working 2 jobs. And they did that because it was very important to them that I go to college and that my sisters went to college, and that we not have that huge weight on our shoulders. And, you know, a lot of you guys might have heard that there is $1 trillion of student loan debt weighing down Americans right now. That's actually more than the credit card debt. Is Andrew Kelly in the room? Andrew Kelly of AEI? I think he was before, but anyway, Andrew Kelly wrote a brilliant chapter in Room to Grow about higher education, and one of the things that he points out that's pretty disturbing is that, okay, so, you know, $1 trillion in student loan debt, well, you know, those guys finished college, they're earning more money because of it, fair enough, they're able to shoulder that burden, but actually here's the thing, the college completion rate in the United States is not 100%. It's nowhere close to that. I was kind of hoping Andrew was here because he'd tell you chapter and verse exactly what that number is. But it's actually lower than half, I believe. And so what that means is that there are a lot of people who are taking on this non-recourse student loan debt. And guess what? They're not even getting a degree out of it. So I was able to get out with a college degree, and it made a huge difference in my life. Not just because it gave me skills, it gave me networks, it gave me relationships. It enabled me to do this kind of job that, frankly, would have been a complete fantasy, you know, from the perspective of my 16-year-old self. But, you know, that meant a lot for me. But there are a huge number of Americans for whom that promise is not actually being realized. So when you look at the way we talk about higher education generally, what do we hear about? Well, we hear, well, gosh, you know, we need more subsidies. Well, you know what we need to do? We need parent plus loans. We need to create a situation in which parents can take as much debt as colleges charge tuition, whether or not they'll be able to carry that debt. So you solve a liquidity problem. You let parents who love their kids take out loan after loan after loan that frankly they can't necessarily afford to pay. And then their kids are not actually finishing because you've got higher education institutions that are failing young Americans. And so, that's the thing. There's one perspective that says that, well, look, we've got this system. Let's not mention that it's completely broken. Let's let them get away with failing young people again and again. Let's not impose any accountability or any transparency on these schools. And that's the way we're the good guys. We're going to give more money to these schools. We're going to let you, the parents, take on more debt. And then we're the good guys. But actually, think about what you've all talked about before. What we need is that middle space between the individual and the federal government. We need to create new institutions of higher education. We need to see to it that colleges and universities are accountable to students and parents. We need to see to it that students have some reliable sense that, getting a degree in sports management is not necessarily going to translate into a lucrative career that's going to get you out of your parents' house when you're 25 years old. If you don't have those connections. Students need those market signals. They're not stupid. They're working incredibly hard. They're working a lot harder than kids, 20, 30 years ago a lot of the time because they actually have bigger barriers. Sometimes they don't come from intact families like the one that I came from. So, that's what Andrew Kelly writes about in this book. It's that it's not just about giving more money. It's about actually rethinking these institutions. And so, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say that, well, look, reform conservatives, they want to help poor people. What's different from what liberals want to do? Well, what's different from what liberals want to do is that we want a dynamic process of rethinking these institutions. We want choice. We want accountability. We don't want to just give more money, pour more tax dollars into failing institutions. We want to actually think about those people like my parents who are frankly facing a tougher time today, their equivalents now, because they're facing a wage crunch, right? And sometimes, there are not two parents to make these choices. That's what we've got to think about. We're not old fuddy-duddies. This is not about Ozzie and Harriet. This is about America the way it is right now. This is about people like me. 1/10 of the people in this country are like me and like Ramesh, children of immigrants, okay? And these people face a tougher world. We need new institutions to help them. And that's what this book is all about, and you've got to read it. Thank you.
You should know that while Raihan was speaking, a team of assassins fanned out across the nation and assassinated all college administrators and presidents in a Godfather-style bloodbath. So just bear in mind.
Pete, do you have a reaction
Yeah.
to some of what you've heard?
Yeah. I just want to say this book, the policy proposals are very, very important, and I commend them to you. But the thing that you've heard up here, and I think this is very important for the conservative movement, which is it's not just policies that we're talking about. It's a different cast of mind. It's not a radically different cast of mind, but it is how do you approach it. And I thought Raihan was very nice in the way he formulated that about this sort of dynamic process of rethinking these institutions. There's a kind of creativity that is at the core of, I think, what's animating a lot of what goes under the banner of reform conservatism. And a lot of politics is disposition. It is cast of mind. And sort of to move from a conservatism which is backward-looking and is simply saying stand athwart history and stop, and actually is forward-looking and saying, look, these are the conditions facing Americans in the 21st century. And we've got these institutions and policies and programs, many of which were created in the middle part of the last century. And they need to be reformed and updated and modernized. So I think that's an important sort of bedrock of what we're talking about. It's just not a series of policies, but it's a cast of mind that will drive these reforms.
Ramesh.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points about the size and scope of government. The first is just a political point, which is I think that you need to have some kind of attractive middle-class agenda if you are going to be able to be in the position to do some of the other kinds of government limiting steps that I assume everybody on this panel wants to do. So, for example, in the last couple of elections, Republicans have run on a reasonably bold Medicare reform, and it doesn't appear to have cost them anything politically, but it's also, I think, not in itself a vote winner. You've got to build a bigger political majority if you're going to do that very important work, and I think some of the policies here are helpful in creating that center-right majority and thus limiting government. And second, we shouldn't think about limiting government purely in terms of budget outlays, which we sometimes do. So let's say, for example, that the ideas in Jim Capretta's chapter on healthcare weren't going to cut healthcare spending, although in fact they are, if they were implemented. If you get rid of things like the tax on people who don't buy health insurance, the essential benefits plan, if you reform Medicare so it's much less prescriptive and much more market friendly, all of these things are in a very meaningful sense government limiting, even if they don't affect how much money the federal government is spending. And I'd say that for a lot of other things. A real run at occupational licensure, which is one of the, I think, most positive things to come out of this book and come out of this morning, would be a huge difference in people's lives that comes from restraining the reach of government.
Yuval.
Let me try in part to answer Ross's grim, dour, horrible pessimism. A Jewish optimist is someone who says things can't get any worse than this, and so I'll give it a shot. I do think part of where I disagree with that view is that it takes for granted the sustainability of what we're doing now, which I do not think we can take for granted. It assumes that there are people who are drifting toward the Democratic coalition because they're comfortable with some of the benefits they're being offered and the like. I actually think what's happening in America is something rather different, and that neither party has done a great job of quite recognizing it, and that we've got a Democratic Party that always thinks it's 1965 and a Republican Party that always thinks it's 1981. And I think that if they came to see where we actually are in America, Republicans would find themselves looking at some incredible opportunities, and the Democrats would find themselves looking at some serious problems. And I think that because America, in a way, is in the midst of a transition from a way of life that's built around large, consolidated, centralized institutions, big government, big business, big labor, big media, big universities, big cultural institutions, to a way of life that is built around smaller, dispersed, diverse institutions and communities, where Americans have a huge array of choices in every part of life, and they get to define their options and enable improvements through the choices they make. That's happening everywhere except in government. And to me, that means that the government we have and the approach we have to government is becoming less and less useful to our society. These changes, in a way, offer some great promise and great advantages and great improvements in American life. They also offer great risks and great dangers that are economic, that are cultural, that are structural, that affect people's lives in ways that can lead them to hope and to fear. I think that the left today is stuck defending broken systems that are built for that very different way of thinking about American life, where big government and big labor and big business really do manage the economy, where it's possible to think that the kind of centralizing tendencies of the welfare state are ways of addressing the social problems we have. And the left, again and again, finds itself trying to build on failures and to avoid change and to insist that this isn't happening, that what government can do is prevent these changes from happening, rather than that what government should do is allow people to benefit from the advantages and protect them from the risks. The right obviously has its own problems, but I think that conservatives have a huge amount to offer the public going forward, because our instinctive way of thinking about the role of government and about how to solve problems is very well suited to the challenges that the country faces now and to the way of life that we're going into now. So I don't think we should be thinking from the static place where the problem is liberals are winning, conservatives are losing, and we got to think. That's really not what's happening at all. I think both parties are exhausted at the same time, so that this moment is not like the late 70s and it's not like the late 80s was for the Democrats. It's a much more complicated and challenging moment in a way, but it's also a much more promising moment. And the way to think about the challenges that we face in thinking about policy is about what we can offer the country, given that right now voters think, as Pete's numbers suggest, that neither party is offering them anything. And conservatives are much better positioned to offer Americans a way of understanding where we're headed and of making the most of it than liberals, which leaves me at least a little more optimistic than Ross, but that's not saying much.
We're going to bring this audience into this discussion now. The entire book is highly readable, well documented. The individual subject matter chapters are terrific, but I particularly commend Yuval's opening chapter where he elaborates on the moment conservatives are in, given his conviction that the liberal progressive agenda is spent. There's nothing new, and we're seeing it discredited almost on a daily basis, right, in our headlines, most recently the Department of Veterans Affairs. So he talks about what a moment it is for conservatives. So I recommend the entire book to all of you, but make sure you pay particular attention to that philosophical case that Yuval makes. We're going to start with questions. We'll take two right over here, and then Mona Charan.
Thank you. I'm Jean Millette, attorney and writer, and I have always been involved in politics. And one of the things I remember from my early political education is that states are the laboratories of democracy. And I'm wondering if you would like to comment on that regarding the federal government versus the states, because I think the states could really help out in the new ideas, even loosening the reins of some regulation.
Excellent point. Who'd like to take that? Right on?
Well, I imagine there are other folks on the panel who will have something to say about this, but I do think that, as Ramesh said before, there are a lot of folks on the left who talk about inequality, when in fact it's really the cost of living that's the issue that is most salient for most working and middle-income Americans. And when you think about those cost of living issues, think about this big debate we're having about the minimum wage, and think about the fact that most conservatives are totally flat-footed. They do not know what to say. They prefer to change the subject when we start talking about the minimum wage. But then look at the fact that, okay, there are two states where you've had big increases in the minimum wage recently, California and Connecticut, okay? So let's reflect on that. In California, you've got a state where it is pretty much impossible to find an affordable rental anywhere close to where you might find a job, okay? Why is that? Is that because of some law of God or nature? It's true, you've got mountains, you've got coasts, but you're not allowing people to build. It's astonishing. It's so impossible to build that what you end up doing is you end up empowering a lot of people who already own real estate in those places, right? So basically, you're talking about the minimum wage. We talk about the minimum wage because we care about the standard of living, whether or not people have money they can save. And you've seen this big change in the United States where huge numbers of African Americans, who, by the way, tend to overwhelmingly be Democrats, where are they moving? They're moving from the Northeast. They're moving from places like California, and they're moving to places like Dallas and Houston and Atlanta. And they're not moving to these places because they're right-wingers. They're moving to these places because these are places where they can find affordable housing, because you have state and local policies that are actually about getting people in homes and seeing to it that they have the disposable income that they need to really make a life for themselves. And that's why state policies matter a lot, and we're seeing a natural experiment in this country right now where you see that conservative places that all they're doing is letting people build. And you're seeing middle-class people go to those places, flocking to those places. And I think that, we need to think about how federal policies can actually, kind of nudge, well, that's another conceptual question. I imagine some of us would disagree about that. But I think that we need to think about that rather than one-size-fits-all policies.
Ramesh.
I should jump in since my contribution to the book is about the Constitution and constitutional issues. I think that when we talk about federalism, conservatives sometimes overemphasize sort of abstract principles and political propriety, and we need to talk a little bit more about the practical benefits of applying these constitutional principles. I think that, Medicaid is a great example where kind of the commingling of funds, the absence of separation of spheres between the state governments and the federal government have created a situation where we get more government and we get worse government and we get less accountable government. And moving towards accountable government ought to be a bigger part of our sort of constitutional rhetoric.
We have a second question here, and then Mona.
My name's Arnold Kling, and I skimmed through the book, had a first pass, and it strikes me that it has the strengths and weaknesses of conservatives, and that sort of philosophically and diagnostically it's strong. But then it gets, whenever it talks about solutions, my sense is that it tends to be very tentative, kind of timid, and not with a clear, this is what we would do in the first 6 months of administration. There's no 100 days kind of thing. Is there a plan to come out with kind of a
That's the next
deeper
book.
version? Yeah.
No. When you have the chance, I recommend you do more than skim. I think you will see that there are a lot of concrete proposals, but I'll turn the microphone over to Yuval.
Well, I want to make a case in favor of timidity. I think conservatives have to start when thinking about government from the point of view that we do not know how to solve big social problems, and the left doesn't either. In thinking that the left doesn't either, we are left to undo a lot of the damage they're trying to do, and that's extremely important. But we should not replace that with big, bold, massive conservative legislation that says we know exactly how to solve these problems. And the problem with your technocrats is that they got the math a little wrong in subsection 7, but our technocrats can fix that. I think what we need is a different approach to how we do policy at the federal level. And that different approach has got to think in terms of facilitating society's attempts to solve its problems. That's not going to look like a conservative version of the Great Society. It's going to look like a very different approach to public policy.
It'll be experimental in part.
Yeah, it'll create venues and platforms for people to experiment with solutions in an ongoing way. Not that you're going to find the ultimate answer someday and then we'll have done it. But American society is always going to be doing that, is always going to be incrementally solving problems, accidentally creating other problems, dealing with those, dealing with cultural change. We're not working toward an end here where ultimately we've reached the ideal great society and now it's all working fine as long as everybody does what they're told. We're trying to create a situation where people can live free lives and where government exists to help them do that and to deal with some of the problems that only government can help to deal with. That's going to be a much more modest approach to public policy than maybe we're used to in America. I think that would be a huge improvement.
However, no, go ahead.
So if you look at the track record of the sort of huge legislative initiatives of the last 3 administrations, and no offense to people who may have served in some of those administrations, I don't think politically or substantively that track record is particularly good. Almost all of these things, whether you're talking about the Clintons' health care initiative not going anywhere, or President Bush's Social Security initiative, or the way Obamacare is rolled out, I don't think any of it, almost any of it, has particularly gone well or is something that Americans look back on fondly. So I think that should tell us something, and to sort of maybe recast the point that you've all made. I think we need to make a kind of bold break with the sweeping vision.
Okay, well, wait. Well, let me speak up for the sweeping vision, though. Again, as someone who didn't write a chapter and is not officially affiliated with this project, I think that if you sat down and distilled policy proposals, which out of a substantial portion of these chapters, you would have a pretty sweeping. We can call it a first 100 days agenda. We can call it a first 365 days agenda. Whatever you want to call it, but it wouldn't maybe have the sweepingness of the New Deal or the Great Society, and obviously I agree with my colleagues on this panel that isn't a sweepingness that conservatives should go for. But I think that between tax reform, higher ed reform, entitlement reform, I mean, you can go down the list and come up with a number of sort of, you could call them sort of bold incrementalism, I guess, that would get you pretty quickly to a pretty substantial list of policies. And again, I mean, I completely agree that, the lessons of the last several administrations are that, passing any kind of policy is extremely difficult, and the kind of policy that you do pass and so on tends not to be what you had hoped it would be necessarily. But at this point, we're a long ways from having that kind of dilemma for a conservative reform agenda. So at this point, I would like to stress the fact that, let's say, a future Republican Congress and Republican Senate were to pass in the first 100 days a tax reform that I personally would favor, which would be some combination of Mike Lee's proposals on the one hand and what Dave Camp put out on the other. And, that's a very broad sort of sketch, but basically a sort of conservative-leaning tax reform that is more family-friendly than, let's say, what the Wall Street Journal would tend to support. That would be a big deal. We haven't had tax reform of any substantial kind in the U.S. in 30 years, and doing something like that plus one or two of the other ideas here.
Well, the healthcare agenda would be a big
Well, right. If you passed Jim Capretta's healthcare plan in your first 100 days, that would be the first sweeping conservative healthcare reform policy passed by the United States Congress in all of American history. No, that's not fair. But I think in terms of its scale, it would be substantial, and the same would be true if you took some version of, we don't have to look at this book. You can look at sort of ideas that Senator Lee and Senator Rubio and others have put together. If you passed Marco Rubio, a sort of fleshed out version of Marco Rubio's safety net reforms, that would be the most substantial reform of the safety net since welfare reform itself. So again, I completely agree that it's important to, not sort of fall into the trap of, revolutionary politics and so on. But it's also useful at this juncture when we're very, very far away from imagining any of this taking real form, as Senator McConnell very kindly reminded us, that emphasizing the possibility of substantial reform is useful.
I think part of what this gets at, and I agree with that entirely, is maybe we're taking the question in two different ways, but given that so many of our public problems are functions of bad public policy, addressing them in a different way does mean a bold change in what the government is doing. It does mean undoing a lot of the damage that has been done in the last 50 years, because if you think about the nature of the public problems, what we think of as our public policy problems, so many of them are functions of great society programs gone wrong. And there's no way around the need to change that pretty dramatically. And so these kinds of reforms would involve very bold changes to what government is doing now. I think what they would not involve is nearly as bold an approach to society on the part of government, but a much different attitude about society from government. That would require a lot of change. A lot of these things would be pretty dramatic conservative reforms.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, echo what you've all said, which is what we're talking about here is to essentially play on different ground than we have. I mean, what this requires is actually a pretty fundamental shift in how conservatives speak about and understand and explain to the public the organizing principles of these reforms. Too often, I think conservatives have simply said, look, government is too big and we ought to spend less, and not talking about the purposes of government, just simply talking about the size. And where conservatives and Republican lawmakers, I think, have to get much more fluent is in their capacity to explain how we see these things different and how we view the role of government in people's lives in a way that actually helps them in their present circumstances. I would not underestimate the importance of that as a frame around these issues. And in any event, if Ross is right in his predictions, we're not going to have to worry about a 100-day agenda for a long, long time.
Well, I'm trying to merge pessimism and mild optimism in one.
You're trying to win yourself
package.
back in our favor.
Ryan, you had a reaction.
Oh, no, I actually was hoping to hear other.
Okay, good. Mona Charon, we have a question from Mona, and then we'll move over to this side.
In 2012, at the Democratic Convention, there was an opening video that some of us watched because we have to. And it said the government, and then there was a pastiche of faces of different ethnicities and colors and ages and so on. It's the one thing that brings us all together. It's the one thing we have in common. Now, this theme is reiterated frequently by Democrats. When Republicans make criticisms about government policy, they're kind of accusing them of being anti-patriotic, unpatriotic, because they're criticizing the government. So my question for the panel is this something that the Republicans need to have a response to? And if so, what is that response?
Yuval, it sounds like an opening chapter question.
Well, I certainly agree with you. I think that the instinctive response that a lot of Republicans had was to defend the place of the individual, which is very important to do. We did that also in 2012 because of the "you didn't build that" stuff that rubbed us the wrong way, to put it very mildly. But I think it's very important for Republicans in thinking about what's really wrong with that argument, the notion that government is the one thing we all do together. What's really wrong with that is that it misses almost everything we actually do together. That is, everything that stands between the individual and the government, which is where American society has always been at its best, where America has always been its best self. everything from the family through the community, through civil society and religious institutions, to the market economy, are things we do together that are not government. And in fact, the purpose of government is to sustain a space where those things can be done in a free way, and a way that allows people to achieve the goals they want together. The alternative to progressivism is not radical individualism. Those two things are the same thing. The vision of government at the core of progressivism is society consists of individuals and the state, and that's it. And the purpose of the state is, in fact, to enact a kind of radical individualism. And the conservative answer to that is that society consists of the things we do together, one of which is government, but by no means the most important one, or the most central one, or the one that serves us best. And so the conservative answer to that is society. And society is not at all the same thing as government. Government is just one of the things society does to allow itself to solve problems. It is nowhere near the only one or the most important one.
Just to add one more point on that, I think that I completely agree with what Yuval was saying as sort of an answer to a kind of collectivist argument or rhetoric. But I think it's also important to note it's a much better answer than the one that conservatives are often inclined to give, which is to respond to collectivism with a kind of rhetoric of commercial individualism. That's part of what's wrong, I think, with the overemphasis on entrepreneurship that we've seen, at a kind of an overemphasis that's sometimes tipped all the way over into Randianism. With its sort of implicit message, we'll cut your taxes and you'll solve your own problems, as opposed to, well, it will help your community thrive, we will reform institutions so that they are supporting you instead of trying to direct your life. We can't cede the entire field of community over to the left.
Let's take two more questions. I'm going to move to this side of the room. You've been such an attentive audience for the better part of the morning. We will try to end on time. We have a question back here from somebody who hasn't asked one yet.
My name is Bob. Do I need the, okay. Bob, my name is Bob Patterson. I'm a regular contributor to the Philadelphia Inquirer. My question is for Yuval. In your opening remarks, you pasted this contrast between a welfare state model and a market model of government. Is there not a third model that maybe the reform conservatives ought to think about? And what I mean by a third model is one that goes back to Alexander Hamilton, who talked about the American school, and Henry Clay, who talked about the American system, and Lincoln, who built the Continental Railroad. He was a real fan of Clay. Teddy Roosevelt built the Panama Canal, even parts of FDR's effort, Ike's efforts, JFK, that used government to do big projects that had tremendous economic results and dramatically raised living standards and elevated the middle class. Is there not a third model, if we want to call the American system, where the government does have a sort of not a prominent but a trigger role that does these big projects that has huge effects, good effects on the middle class?
Yeah, I would say this is what I mean when I say facilitating the function of society, including of the market. There is certainly a place for government to enable these other institutions to function. And in fact, there are times and places where only government would provide the kind of infrastructure, physical infrastructure, even social infrastructure, that allows these kinds of institutions to function. The question is, do you see government in a management role, or do you see government in a facilitating role? And I think the facilitating role is much more friendly to this idea that you're suggesting, the kind of Hamiltonian American system, Henry Clay American system, that basically says government's role is to enable people to thrive. It doesn't define how they're going to do it. It creates the circumstances that makes it more likely that they will thrive. I think that's very friendly to the kind of conservative notion I'm describing. And the market is not the only institution that fills that space. And so in talking about market orientation, I don't think we're suggesting that it's about turning everything over to markets. It's about using the ways in which markets successfully solve problems to solve problems in other arenas of life. And that certainly includes creating the infrastructure that allows American society to thrive. I think that is a role for government, but it has to be understood in a limited way, as a supporting role, and not in a way that defines all the goals and manages all the projects and tells people what to do at the end of the day. And, it's a different way of thinking about fundamentally the relationship between the state and society.
I just want to add quickly that that's very vividly illustrated in the book by the chapters by Andrew Kelly and Rick Kess, both of AEI. You really see that with regard to education in particular, the way that the job is to facilitate and create space for innovation.
We have one last question right here. Jennifer.
I was really interested in your comments on education and the real scam that's happening where kids are taking on debt for degrees or non-degrees that will not enable a better future. And so I wanted to ask if you've given some thought to actual practical work experience, because in Boehner's district, supported by Governor Kasich, there's a terrific program called Project Search, where young people with disabilities spend their last year of school doing a series of 3 internships. Over the course of the year, they learn how to work. What's interesting about that is that 70% of those kids get jobs afterwards, okay? These are kids with very significant disabilities who otherwise would spend their entire lives on benefits. Yet they're more likely to get a job out of that than kids who go to college, and certainly University of Phoenix. And so I wondered if you've looked at the model of these really structured, really mentored internships as a way to help people deal with poverty and get out of poverty in the way that it's happening with Project Search, or like the IDF handles it in Israel, where they get that real practical experience.
Or, I bet Raihan will have a responsive remarks to make. But I'll remind you that our 2 education authors who did higher ed and K through 12 are both here at AEI. And your specific question might be better directed at them because they're both so fluid, I think, with promising experiments that are going on.
Just briefly, I mean, I think one of the big challenges we have is that, for a lot of kids, the deficit is actually in non-cognitive skills. Not necessarily things you learn in school, but actually learning the habits of the workplace. And actually, Andrew does write in his chapter about federal support for apprenticeship programs that have been enormously successful. And I think that, that's something we ought to build on. But I think it's also important to say that, look, this is not about denigrating college and its role. It's about saying that we need a universe of post-secondary options that aren't just, let's push everyone in this one direction. And I think that, again, the broader themes of the book are all about that. Let's create kind of institutions that evolve, that are dynamic, that are responsive to those unique challenges that many different communities face. Kids who are eligible for free lunch in the suburbs of Kansas City are very different from those in Brooklyn. You know what I mean? So you need institutions that are actually tailored to that. I do, if Kate will forgive me, want to make one broader point about just the day. So you've seen Mike Lee and Tim Scott, definitely committed Tea Party conservatives. You've also seen folks who are identified with the so-called Republican establishment. You've seen a variety of different conservatives here today, and you'll notice that they're all talking about the same things, which is that rather than just having the same kind of arid fights that we've been having for a very long time, let's actually move forward and talk about what we can do for working and middle-income Americans. How can we actually be relevant to the challenges of their day-to-day lives? And again, this is not about left versus right. This is about actually what are the problems that we're actually talking about. And for me, at least, this is very, very encouraging. It's just the start. We have a lot more work to do. But I think that this is very, very good news. And it's because the thing is that it's natural for all of us. When you scratch the surface of any conservative, scratch the surface of any conservative lawmaker in Congress or in a state legislature, they see these problems unfolding. They're seeing what fragile families are doing to people. They're seeing how, student loan debt is weighing people down, how our schools are failing. They're seeing all of this stuff, but they haven't always had a language for how to talk about this. And this is what the YG Network is trying to do. This is what Room to Grow is trying to do. And I think that we need a lot more of this, but I think that we've made a pretty good start.
Raihan, I definitely couldn't have said it better myself. So I won't try. With the launch of this book, we're hoping to launch this kind of a discussion. Thank you so much for your attention. Please join me in thanking these panelists.